Today I'm going to be showing you how to diagnose and change a faulty brake master cylinder. The brake master cylinder is the component that creates the hydraulic pressure necessary to drive the slave cylinders on each of the four wheels. And the most common symptom of a brake master cylinder failing is when you go to press the brake pedal, you can feel the pedal slowly but surely hit the bottom of its travel before any brake force is applied to the wheels. Now this also can cause the car to pull towards one side. So if you're getting any of those symptoms, that when you hit the brakes, the pedal sinks to the floor before anything's noticeable at all with braking force, then your master cylinder is probably at fault. The brake master cylinder is located here underneath the brake fluid reservoir. The first job, if we're going to change this, is we need to empty the fluid that's in the reservoir out. We need to get rid of it so we can take it off. There's a number of ways we can do this. The easiest method, if you've got an old syringe or a turkey baster, is to dip it in the tank, removing the filler cap, and basically syringe the fluid out. But I don't have anything like that, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to attach my brake bleeding kit to one of the wheel cylinders on the caliper, and basically I'm just going to open it up, pump the pedal until all the fluid is expelled into the container here. That's just the way I do it. You can do it whatever way you like. If you've got an old syringe, the more the better. So I'm going to attach this onto the caliper, open the bleed screw and pump the pedal to push all the fluid out of the reservoir into the container. I've removed the road wheel just for clarity so you can see better with the camera. The first thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to remove the rubber cover off the bleed screw cap here. Place that to one side. It is also worth noticing that now we're going to be dealing with brake fluid for a continually long period of time. It's worth putting some just disposable gloves on, just keeps it off your hands. You should really be using one of these things, a flare nut wrench. And what this is basically, it's a cross between an open spanner and a ring spanner. But you can see this would grip, focus in, this thing will grip your bleed nipple on all four sides. But unfortunately this bleed screw on here is too far gone for this. I'm going to have to use a pair of water pump pliers to undo this nut. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to crack this nut off. Just as it starts to go, I'm going to stick the end of my tube on here, and all this tube just ends up in a bottle to take the waste brake fluid. So I'm going to stick that on the end here. You do need a clear bit in it later on so you can see where the air bubbles are coming through when we come to bleed it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to turn that so that's loose. I'll also leave a loop of this stuff up here so that when I do hit the brake pedal, you can see the stuff filtering through. If I leave that there, you should start to see the brake fluid coming through. So that's now loose. On here you can see that starting to turn. I'm going to go inside the car and hit the brake pedal and expel all of the brake fluid down from the reservoir, down the tube here, and into our container to empty the brake fluid reservoir. See the fluid coming through there. Once we've expelled all the brake fluid, I'm going to go ahead and close this valve off. I'm going to start by turning it just using the rubber here, and I'm going to pull my hose off and stick the container elsewhere out of view. I'm then just going to nip the thing back up with my pliers again. You should use a flare nut wrench, but this bleed nipple's too far gone for that. The thing is 14 years old. So that's now tightened up, and I'm just going to stick that back on temporarily because we're still going to need to get to that to bleed the brakes once we've finished. Okay, so now we know that the master cylinder is empty, the fluid reservoir. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to remove the cap and just confirm. I can see there is still a bit of fluid in there actually, so I'm going to have to be very careful when I remove this thing that the fluid doesn't go all over the place, which is why I have here an old towel. It's very important, you must keep plenty of these handy. Brake fluid makes an excellent paint stripper. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this towel all around underneath here to soak up the excess fluid when I separate the reservoir from the cylinder itself, because we need to remove the reservoir to get to these these bolts here that hold the actual brake lines on. So before we do all that, I'm going to also remove the connector for the brake fluid warning light. It's very important we remember to connect this later on. So I'm going to tuck that out of the way somewhere down here. Also remove the throttle cable out of harm's way. Don't be afraid to unclip things like this fuel line here. If that's going to be in the way, then I'm sure we can get rid of that somewhere. There we go. So what I'm doing now is I'm just going to place this towel in and around the area just to soak up any brake fluid that does escape. Now the only thing now that's holding this on, that's holding the reservoir to the master cylinder, is a cotter pin that goes through it. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull the cotter pin out that holds the two of them together. There we have the pin that holds them together. Put that to one side. Now when I pull this off, there could be quite a deluge if there's some left in the bottom, so I'm going to pull it off. Yeah, there's still some left on it. And here we have the fluid reservoir. Now that we've got the fluid reservoir off, I'm going to go ahead and remove our towel. You can see it's soaked up a bit of brake fluid there that's leaked out. I'm going to toss that to one side, and I'm just going to use a rag just to clean up around the area here. You can see it has dribbled a bit down the back. Next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take our flare nut wrench and I'm going to use it on these two lines here. And I think this is 11mm. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put it on here, put it all the way down, and just crack these lines off, just like that. Now these flare nut wrenches, they grip the nuts, the head of the nut, on all of the 6 sides. So because these nuts are often only made of copper or brass, because they're only very soft metal, it doesn't cause any damage to them, and it puts even pressure on each of the surfaces. So this one's going here, I can feel it's going. You do get a bit stiff, so it's coming. There we go, that's the first hydraulic circuit off. So the rear one is going to be done next. This one could be quite awkward given its position. Should be nothing it can't manage. I can tell somebody who's done this before in the past hasn't used a flare nut wrench, so they've deformed the head of the nut, which makes it very, very difficult to get the flare nut wrench actually on the thing. Alright, I'm afraid we've got a slight problem with this, the rear brake line here. The problem is somebody's had this off in the past and not used a flare nut wrench on it, and they've deformed the head of the brake line. So what's happening is on the head here, I cannot get the wrench on it like I can that, so I'm just going to have to use, I'm afraid, an ordinary spanner on this rear line to get that off. And even then I'm having trouble getting the ordinary spanner on it, simply because the head has been deformed sometime in the past. Let's go in. Let's go in now. I'm going to use here a pair of pliers just to help twist the thing, getting it off. It's a bit awkward to get your fingers in there. As long as you don't grip the head of it mega hard with the pliers, you should be alright. Can we turn that by hand now? I'm going to unclip the brake lines from here just to make it a bit easier. Yeah, we can turn that by hand. Alright, there we have it. Both of the brake lines are off. They're the two brake lines that go off to the ABS pump. The only thing now holding the master cylinder to the brake booster and the rest of the car is two bolts either side of it here, or two nuts actually, and they're 13mm, so I'm going to get me long socket on those, and those should crack off really easy, one on each side. And those should pop off, no trouble at all. There's number one. And there's number two. And the master cylinder should therefore just simply slide out. And there we have the master cylinder. Before I go ahead and put the new master cylinder on, I'm just going to go and clean up the area around the brake booster. Should be suffice now. I've got my new master cylinder here. I'm just going to go ahead and remove the caps. Also remove the spongy thing there. I'm just going to slot it down, making sure the pin on the brake booster in there goes into the hole here. So I'm going to align the thing up, making sure that everything lines up properly. There we have it. Go ahead and bolt it back in place. First bolt on this side. The second bolt on the other side, I'm going to put that on using the end of the socket here. Just go ahead and tighten the thing up, making sure not to cross thread it, of course. Go ahead and put the ratchet on it and tighten it up. Tight. Again, you want these to be fairly tight because you do not want this component coming off in a hurry. Okay, so those are fairly tight. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and reattach these lines, but again the ends, they are a bit funny. I'm going to give them a bit of a wipe. Just make sure there's no debris in the threads either. Yeah, this head's seen a bit of abuse in the past, I'm afraid, so this is what happens if you don't use a flare nut wrench on it. It damages the head of the fixture, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to put this one back in using the using the standard socket would probably damage the poor thing even more. I'm going to go ahead and line the thing up in its hole and screw it gently in place. Try not to block the camera view here so you can see what I'm doing, but it's very hard. Again, this thing is a bit awkward to get my fingers to, so I might have to do it up gently using the pliers, because as I said, it is quite awkward to get your fingers in there. It sometimes helps if you wiggle the brake line to make it easier to do the fitting up. I'll show you that. It's still going. It's got quite stiff now, so I'm going to put my spanner on it. Just trying to knit the thing up. Now that the rear brake line's in, I'm going to go ahead and put the front one in. I'm only using front and rear brake lining in terms of the position of them on the car. It's not like this does the front wheels and that one does the rear wheels. I'm just calling it front and rear for filming purposes. Go ahead and screw this front one back into position. So again, get my flared up wrench, stick that around there and do it up. Okay, making sure it's tight, and that should do us. Okay, the next stage is to go ahead and fit the fluid reservoir. As you might have noticed, I have cleaned this up a bit, and especially cleaned the areas around here where it's got to seal onto the master cylinder. So I'm going to go ahead and fit this, and they've also provided with the new master cylinder a new pin and locking washers to go on the end of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and place this on top of the master cylinder, and giving it, pushing it down nicely, seated nicely on top of it. I'm going to go ahead and take our locking pin and push that through, and I'm also going to put the two locking washers on the end of the pin. I'm going to stick those on the end of that. Might be advisable to push those on with a pair of pliers. They are quite tough, those things. Now that the reservoir's in place, we can begin to fill it up. So I've got a funnel here. Again, the funnel must be clean. The essence from now onwards is to keep the operation as clean as possible, because we don't want to contaminate the brake fluid. I'm going to put the funnel into the reservoir here, and I'm then going to pour it out from my container of .4 fluid here. You could have a second person helping you if you like, but I haven't got a second person with me. So I'm going to go ahead and begin to get some fluid in there. You can see the fluid level rising up now. It doesn't need to be full. As long as it's about halfway up for now, that should do fine. I'm going to go ahead and remove that. And stick that to the side, again on a rag. We don't want to get this stuff on the bodywork of the vehicle. Alright, so now I'm going to talk to you about the next important stage of this process, which is bleeding the brakes. There's two methods of doing this. The first method is the simplest and the easiest and requires the less tools, and that's known as the two-man method, where basically you have the contraption I showed you before, which is a length of tube into the bottle. You attach it to each wheel cylinder, and an assistant sits in the car, depresses the pedal, you crack it off, let the fluid through, crack it back down, the system releases the pedal. That method's alright if you have an assistant, but unfortunately I don't. So I've got this thing here, which is a brake bleeding kit. It's a universal kit. It comes with several adapters to fit most makes and models of car. They're available fairly cheaply on the internet. And what you do is you pick the cap that fits your fluid reservoir, you go ahead and screw it on, and it has a tube leading to this container here. In this container you fill with your fresh brake fluid, and this screws on the top. And this tube here leads from the bottom of this container all the way up to the top of your fluid reservoir. Now you can guess what's going to happen when you put compressed air into the top of this container here. What happens is the compressed air comes up this black line here into the top of the container and forces the fresh fluid in here up the tube, up and out, up through this tube, through the cap, into your fluid reservoir. So it basically provides an extended fluid reservoir for when you're bleeding the brakes. And all you do is you connect this up to your compressed air supply, and all you do is you go around each wheel and crack the bleed screw off until the air stops coming out, crack it back round again. And you just do each wheel individually. There's no need for anybody to pump or even touch the brake pedal inside the car. That's what makes it so good. You can do this with one guy and one guy only. Now this kit I bought off the internet. It was originally intended to be supplied with compressed air from your spare tyre, but it's a bit too much faffing for my liking, going having to pump the spare tyre up again. So I've put a bayonet fitting on the end of mine, and I can run this off the air compressor at a very low pressure. It's very important. This thing only needs to run off about 1.5 bar, so I've got a regulator on the compressor and I've turned it right down. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to screw that on there, I'm going to fill this up with fresh brake fluid, I'm going to connect that to my compressor, and I'm going to go around each wheel and just crack each bleed screw off until the air stops coming out and tightening it up again. You need to keep an eye on the fluid in here, but the fluid level in this should be plenty to bleed each circuit on the car. Okay, so this is the final wheel that I'm going to bleed now. It's important when you do bleed the wheels that you bleed the one furthest away from the master cylinder first. So this is the one at the front off side. You want to bleed the rear near side wheel first in that order, so that you don't get any air trapped in the system by mistake. So again, I've got my bleed nipple here. I'm going to stick on my tube like this. I've already cracked it off so that it's loose. Now what I'm going to do, if I show you the tube there on the camera, I'm going to just undo it. You can see the fluid whizzing through there. I'll try and stop it when the air comes through, but I don't think there's going to be much air on this because I've already bled both of the circuits to the ABS pump, so I don't think there's going to be much air to come through. Oh, there we go. There's a bit of air coming through now. I don't know if you can see that on the camera, but there's just a bit of air coming through there. And I'm looking now to do it up when there's nice clean fluid coming through with no air bubbles. Which I think is probably about now. I can't see any more air to come through from that. The fluid that's coming through looks fairly clean. I'll give it a couple more seconds just to make sure. I think I can safely say that that's come through clean. So I'm going to go ahead and do this back up again. So I've tightened that up just by hand, so I can now pull my tube off. And again, this needs some new bleed. This needs new bleed nipples on here because the threads are absolutely ruined on them. So I'm just going to tighten this up with the water pump pliers for now, before the new before I get some new bleed nipples. The bleed nipples do come out, they're easy enough to change, there's no point changing the whole caliper just because one of the bleed nipples is ruined. So I'm going to go ahead and just use the water pump pliers on it, just to get a better grip and a final tug on it with this, just to tighten it up. I'm going to put my bleeds, my rubber cover back on that, wherever the bung's gone. I'm just going to stick that on there. And now we're going to go in the car. We're going to disconnect the automatic bleed kit from under the bonnet. We're going to go in the car, and what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to check that the pedal is nice and hard. We shouldn't expect any sponginess in the pedal if we've expelled all the air from the hydraulic circuits. Okay, so what I've done now, I've sorted everything out under the bonnet. I've put everything back. I've put the cap back on the expansion tank, and also very importantly, remember to connect up the wiring for the warning light. You don't want to leave that disconnected. Now, providing all that's done and all the bleed screws are shut off and everything's tight, the pedal should be very, very hard when we go to press it. And I'm going to stamp on it a couple of times, just so there's no vacuum left in the engine. I know this type of engine doesn't have a vacuum, it's pump driven, but you should pump the pedal a couple of times just to make sure there's no vacuum left. I can tell you that, you can hear that pedal's solid. Perfect, just the way you want it. There shouldn't be any sponginess in it. You might get a slight movement to start with as the slats taken up in the mechanism. Like that, you can hear that brake pedal's solid. Perfect, job done.